Women have not wrecked railroads, nor corrupted legislature, nor done many unholy things that men have done. But then we must remember that we have not had the chance. Jane Addams thought this. Why? Because women did not have rights. Women's Suffrage, Collaboration Through Communication by Arya Pangarkar and Julia Pearl. How did the NWSA and the AWSA joining together affect the impact of the women's suffrage protests in the U.S. in the early 1900s? We discovered that the National Women's Suffrage Association, the NWSA, founded in 1869 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, was very influential in the first wave of the fight for women's suffrage. The American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, also founded in 1869 mainly by Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell, was important because it had a big impact on suffrage for all races. They combined in 1890 to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, where they put aside their differences to focus entirely on women's suffrage. Collaboration between the NWSA and the AWSA significantly impacted the women's suffrage protests because they were able to combine their tactics, broaden their ideas, and focus on both state and federal levels, which resulted in an intensified influence the protests had on the people. The women's suffrage movement was a 72-year-long attempt to pass the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote, beginning in 1848. Well-known suffragists included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Lucy Stone, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Protests, public debates, speeches, petitions, and other methods were used to get suffrage. Women were denied rights from the start, as women were supposed to focus on housework and mothering, not politics, ownership, and jobs. Some men also thought that if women did the same things as them, they could be at the same ranks, or even surpass them, which led to the denial of women's rights. The National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA, was founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1869 in New York City. NWSA opposed the 15th Amendment because it prioritized African American men, who were thought to not be citizens of the U.S., and their right to vote instead of women. What started as an attempt to get women to vote before African American men turned into a racist movement against African Americans. Some of the methods NWSA and others used to bring awareness to their fight were public debates, newspapers, speaking tours, pamphlets/papers, and more. The Revolution, written by Susan B. Anthony, was an NWSA newspaper used to publicize the fight for women's rights. The newspaper's motto was justice, not favors. Men their rights and nothing more. Women their rights and nothing less. They talked about women's rights to suffrage, education, and divorce. The AWSA was founded by Lucy Stone, her husband Henry Brown Blackwell, lecturer Julia Ward Howe, writer Mary Livermore, and famous preacher Henry Ward Beecher in 1869 in Cleveland, Ohio. Its headquarters were located in Boston, Massachusetts. The AWSA became the more popular suffragist group due to its moderate aims of gaining voting rights for women first, then taking on all the other rights women didn't have. The AWSA supported the 15th Amendment, and they used a state-to-state strategy to get suffrage. Lucy Stone, one of the AWSA founders, established the Women's Journal in 1870, a popular suffrage newspaper that featured the AWSA's meetings, suffrage problems, and strategies. The journal ended in 1931. The AWSA was separately formed from the NWSA because of their different beliefs. The AWSA included men, women, and abolitionists who were more conservative and focused on organizing at a more local level. They ended up drafting a constitution on the state ranks for women's suffrage, working more on revising state constitutions compared to the NWSA, which worked on trying to amend the federal constitution. On February 18, 1890, the NWSA and the AWSA joined together after Lucy Stone suggested an umbrella association of the two opposing groups. However, amidst the constant effort, the combination of both groups did not happen immediately. Eventually, the two organizations agreed on terms to merge and notified the public in an open letter to the women of America. They became known as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. While Elizabeth Cady Stanton was chosen as the first president, she didn't enjoy the office work.
despite addressing the NAWSA, so Susan B. Anthony, her vice president, took over most of the administrative duties. Stanton finished out her 2-year term and resigned, and Anthony led the organization until 1900. Anthony mentored 2 presidents following her reign, Anna Howard Shaw, 1904 to 1915, and Carrie Chapman Catt, 1900 to 1904, then again 1915 to 1920. The NAWSA combined both the NWSA and the AWSA's techniques for their pursuit of suffrage, including both state and local groups and press committees. The NAWSA press committee articles were published in newspapers around the country, including updates on the progress of their movement. The mindset of this time often segregated the NAWSA's conventions, even when they claimed they fought for all women. Most often, the state governments would prevent women of color from attending meetings and events for the association. Although they had several unsuccessful protests and ratifications of amendments, the rallying helped the association create the base for their plans in the fight for women's suffrage. Many people opposed these movements and therefore events that supported them, such as the 1913 suffrage parade, making it even harder for women to attain suffrage rights.
The UK's Equal Franchise Act was passed in 1928. The battle was fought in groups including Women's Suffrage and Political Union, WSPU. WSPU was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in frustration of the lack of progress made. Their motto was deeds, not words. Emmeline thought peaceful methods were exhausted and, you could say, overrated. They went with a more radical approach. They tried to cause military disruption and some civil disobedience, such as the rush on Parliament in October 1908, where there was an attempt to invade the House of Commons. Overall, the UK and US have very similar techniques for gaining women's suffrage. Quote, "We march today to give evidence to the world of our determination that this simple act of justice shall be done." On March 3, 1913, a women's suffrage parade commenced, where the National American Women's Suffrage Association organized a march along Pennsylvania Avenue with thousands of women to protest against being excluded from the democratic process. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, the new members of NAWSA's Congressional Committee, were a large part in planning it, intending to get the Susan B. Anthony Amendment passed. The amendment stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of gender. The parade was led by Inez Milholland, a well-known activist, speaker, and lawyer. After Inez, over 20 floats were showcasing the raw beauty and abilities of women. Of course, many disagreed with the parade and suffragists. The marchers found themselves trapped in a sea of hostile, jeering men who yelled vile insults and sexual propositions at them. They were manhandled and spat upon. Unfortunately, the nearby police were of no assistance to the marchers in peril. Women of color like Ida B. Wells Barnett had to fight to be able to participate in the protest. Barnett was instead invited to join the back of the procession, but she turned down the offer and waited outside until her colleagues passed by and joined them.
Through the combination of the fight for state-by-state and the federal level suffrage rights, some states in the West gave women the right to vote, but states from the East and the South did not. This caused Carrie Chapman Catt, the NAWSA's president, to devise a winning plan in 1916 to mobilize local suffrage organizations across the country. Catt's work influenced Woodrow Wilson to change sides, publicly stating his support in 1918, but that wasn't enough to pass the amendment that year. In May of 1919, the chairman of the suffrage committee, Representative James R. Mann, offered the Susan B. Anthony Amendment and passed it through the House and the Senate 2 weeks later. With just barely enough states to get the 3/4 needed to pass it, the decision fell upon Harry T. Burn, the 23-year-old representative for Tennessee. Burn planned to vote against the amendment, but the letter his mother wrote to him caused him to change his mind and vote for the amendment, which got women the right to vote. Imagine if women still couldn't vote if they were still treated only as the caretakers of the house and family. Imagine how different the past elections would have been if there hadn't been the input of women. Voting is such an important responsibility to have because our whole democracy depends on it. So when women were allowed to vote, it changed the abilities and chances of women and how they were viewed in the eyes of men, giving them some equality. This fight for suffrage, although overlooked by many, is very important to the foundation and building of our society today.
In conclusion, the collaboration between the NWSA and AWSA significantly impacted the women's suffrage movement because of the combination of their tactics, broadening of their ideas, and focus on both state and federal levels of government resulted in the adoption and passage of the 19th Amendment, allowing women the right to vote.